Okay, good morning, everybody. It is Monday, April 20th, and this week we are going to be talking about conservation planning. So, today you are going to watch several videos. One is me talking through this lecture, the notes on conservation planning, and then the second two videos are short videos about the role of Indigenous knowledge in conservation and some of the issues with how conservation movements have treated Indigenous peoples in the past. So that's an issue that I'll only cover a little bit in the lecture, and then you'll watch those videos on it. Okay, so the whole point of today and of your reading in the textbook this weekend was, how do we decide which places to protect? We can't protect everywhere. And this is a topic that you've already done some work on in class, right? Right in the beginning of class, I'll move my face up out of the way there. Right in the beginning of class, we did our workshop on spider diversity, and you guys cut out the little pictures of spiders, and then you determined species richness, species diversity, and unique species at 3 sites. And then you made a decision on which places to protect. So that was right in the beginning of class, and it was a really simple activity to decide which places to protect. What we're going to see today is that when you do actual on-the-ground conservation planning, many more considerations come into play than just these metrics. So now that you're further along in the class, you have enough knowledge base to learn the other pieces that come into play. Okay, so when we are deciding which places to protect as conservation planners, we do consider species richness and species diversity, of course. Those are important. But there's other considerations like irreplaceability of the ecosystem or the species, vulnerability of the ecosystem or of the species, and also connectedness of the protected areas. So let's talk about kind of the value of each of those metrics and then some of the problems with only using that metric. So if we were in class, I'd ask you to remember what species richness is and think about some of the problems with only considering species richness when you protect an area. But since we're not in class, I'll just walk you through that myself. So remember that species richness is just how many species are in the community. So way back in the beginning of class when we learned about this, we looked at I made these little macroinvertebrate communities for you. And we have snails, dragonfly larvae, and then 2 species of snails, right? Dragonfly larvae, and then mayflies, dragonfly nymphs, actually. So you can see that both these communities have the same species richness, but you can see just by looking at them that they're not the same. So what are some problems with using just species richness for conservation planning? Well, it doesn't consider species abundance. That's a big problem, right? You're using this metric, you're just as likely to protect that first community as the second community. And the first community looks way healthier, right? There's way more individuals of each species than in the second community. It's also really driven by common species. So common species probably don't need protection, but they're going to increase the species richness in a community. So if you think about this community, both of these communities compared, it looks like you're going to find that little brown snail no matter where you go and no matter what the water's like, the water quality. But that's a common species. It probably doesn't need protection, right? But it's driving that metric of species richness. And of course, you're going to see this is a common trait among the metrics. We don't have this information everywhere. We don't know the species richness everywhere on Earth. What about species diversity? Species diversity we know is a little bit better, right? Because it incorporates species abundance. So if you recall from way back in the beginning of class, when we looked at species diversity, we looked at which, we didn't calculate it. I didn't ask you to learn that in this class, but we did look at, as you can see down here, the different diversity metrics, what it would look like if you did calculate it. And species diversity does give more credit, a higher ranking to that first community, which has not only 4 species, but higher abundances of each of those species. So species diversity is a little better way to look at it, but it's still not incorporating everything, right? When you think about what areas to protect, you probably also want to think about not just species diversity, but what about ecosystem rareness? Is that a system? What about human values? Do people have a cultural value for this ecosystem? Do people get a lot of ecosystem services from this ecosystem? And also things like remoteness. Is this in a really wild place? We want to protect it for that reason. And of course, we don't know species richness everywhere. So that's another disadvantage. So let's look at what do we know about species richness and species diversity globally? What are our global inventories of biodiversity? So the best known organization doing work on global inventories of biodiversity is the IUCN, or the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And you've worked with these guys before, right? You worked with them when we looked at ecosystem services. You picked a region and you went into the IUCN Red List and you looked at different species by region and you imagined what ecosystem services they might provide. So this is a huge organization. There's 15,000 experts that contribute to the data that they use. They have more than 1,300 member organizations and they work in more than 160 countries. So what do? They do a lot of on-the-ground active conservation work, but their main database that helps us understand species richness and diversity is the Red List. So like I said, you guys have worked with this. Hopefully this website looks familiar to you. The Red List was established in 1964, way before the internet, right? And at that time, what scientists were doing was just collecting data and then on species, either collecting data themselves or looking at scientific papers, published papers to see where other scientists had already looked at biodiversity and richness on the ground, and then building all that data into a database to rank species. So over time, since 1964, the IUCN has assessed over 116,000 species. That is a lot of species to have enough data on that you can say whether they are least concern, whether they are vulnerable, whether they are extinct, whether they're critically endangered or extinct. Sorry, that's not actually all the IUCN rankings. We'll look at them in a minute. But just as a side note, okay, so 116,000 species, that's great. That took years and years of work. But remember how many species we estimate that there are on Earth, eukaryotic species? Giving you a minute to try and remember. We estimate that there's 8 million, right? So we definitely don't have this data on all the species that are out there. So just a little quick sidebar, your book talked about this. How do we actually rank species? So if we're going to use species richness and diversity as some of the criteria for whether or not we should protect an area, maybe we also want to look at something like, are the species in that area endangered? Or are they vulnerable to endangerment? So we can look to the IUCN for this type of information too. But here's how the IUCN decides whether species are vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And you can see that like all of these criteria, so to be vulnerable, they have to have had more 50% reduction in population size over 10 years, right? They have to have a small range, and the range is ranked here. So like a vulnerable species that occurs in less than 20,000 square kilometers, whereas an endangered one occurs in less than 5,000 square kilometers, and a critically endangered one occurs in less than 100 square kilometers. So you can look down, and then they're also looking at just population size, right? So vulnerable is less than 1,000 individuals. That's very small already, right? Endangered is less than 250 mature individuals, and critically endangered is less than 50. So you can see that the rankings that you have to get into these criteria are very extreme. They're very rigorous. And these aren't the same criteria that the Endangered Species Act in the United States uses. The Endangered Species Act in the United States has relaxed these criteria a little bit, but these are the ones that IUCN uses. So what I just want you to think about for a second is how much data you would have to collect to know these things about all these species, right? That's a lot of on the ground data. And that's why we only know it about 116,000 species. Okay, so some other criteria that we haven't talked about up till now in the class are, what about criteria like your book talks about, your reading talks about irreplaceability or vulnerability? Those are two different criteria. So irreplaceability is how unique is this species or this ecosystem or this region. If we lose this spot, can we go elsewhere and find it on Earth? Is it still present elsewhere? And vulnerability is something different. Vulnerability is like, how strong are the immediate threats to the species, ecosystem, or region? So you could see how you could be ranked as irreplaceable, but not vulnerable. So what about an ecosystem that's irreplaceable because it doesn't occur anywhere else, like the Mediterranean ecosystems in Southern California? They occur in the Mediterranean, right? They don't occur anywhere else in the United States. So you might consider those irreplaceable, at least in the United States. So, but that's different than how vulnerable they are. That's not the same thing. Those ecosystems actually do happen to be vulnerable because what else is in Southern California? Many, many, many people. Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, really desirable places to live. So an ecosystem can be irreplaceable or vulnerable, or it can be both irreplaceable and vulnerable, right? So I'm gonna walk you through for a second these 9 biodiversity conservation priority templates that your reading talked about. So your reading basically was trying to show you that essentially many different scientists have taken many different approaches to saying, where should we to conserve biodiversity? And they've come up with all these different templates. And if you look at these templates, some of them don't have like a lot of overlapping areas. And some of them do, right? There are areas that come up again and again and again, like the parts of the Brazilian Amazon, coastal regions around the world, but not all the places are shared by every template. So what are these templates? First, let's just go through them. So CE, that's crisis ecoregions. BH is biodiversity hotspots. EBA is endemic bird areas. CPD is centers for plant diversity. MC is megadiversity countries. So that's ranking it by country rather than by actual ecoregion. And country is just a human political line, right? Although it makes sense for if you're thinking about like, oh, these countries have a lot of diversity, we should encourage them to put money into biodiversity conservation. G200, that's ecoregions, important ecoregions. What is that, HB? Oh, high biodiversity wilderness areas. So areas that are both very biodiverse and also very remote. FF, frontier forests. So forests that are kind of still the final frontier. People haven't really penetrated into the entire forest. And you can see those are mostly boreal forests, although some parts of the Brazilian Amazon. And then LW, last of the wild. So something similar to that, but not just forests. So this is ecosystems where they're really very wild still. There's not many roads, there's not many human settlements. So they should be protected for that reason. So let's look at how these fall in terms of the irreplaceability versus the vulnerability criteria. So really only 2 of these think of vulnerability as the primary criteria. That's the crisis ecoregion. They're crisis ecoregions because this looks at who owns the land. So the ones that are marked here are places where there's like tons of private ownership, not a lot of national or state ownership. And so private owners are less likely to want to give up their land for conservation, right? Whereas a state can set aside places more easily. And then biodiversity hotspots, that's also saying that takes into account how threatened the species are as well. So biodiversity and then the number of endangered species. All the rest of these templates look at irreplaceability as at least one of the criteria. They each look at other additional criteria, which I just kind of walked you through a couple minutes ago, but they use irreplaceability so that this doesn't occur anywhere else. So irreplaceability is more common to use in these templates than vulnerability. So the last criteria that your book talked about was this idea of, okay, should we be reactive? Should we prioritize areas that are already really threatened and vulnerable because of human land use, human actions? So protect them because this is our last chance. Or should we be proactive? Let's protect areas like those last wilderness areas where people haven't penetrated yet. Let's protect them before they get in trouble, right? Let's be proactive. And the book created this graphic that kind of tries to visualize how both of those things are prioritized in all of those frameworks, templates. So this is saying like, okay, in A, it's showing you a scale of irreplaceability and vulnerability. And then it's trying to group them also as proactive or reactive. So like biodiversity hotspots, BH in red, that's a template that prioritizes vulnerability, and that's a reactive one. It's saying these places are already endangered. Many of the species in them are endangered. So we need to do something about that now. We have to fix what we already messed up, and we have to deal with these very vulnerable places. So in contrast, the ones on B, they don't consider vulnerability at all. They look at irreplaceability, so like endemic bird areas, and endemic again means, if we were in class, I'd ask you, who knows what endemic means? Endemic means that that species only occurs in that one place. So like on this map, the map of endemic bird areas up here in the upper right, that's showing you places where there's high numbers of bird species that only occur there. And not because they've been hunted out or damaged or anything, just because they evolved there and they only occur there. So the endemic bird area template is proactive and looks at irreplaceability. So it says, look, we know we have these places where there's these bird species that don't occur anywhere else. They're endemic. They're irreplaceable. And so let's go ahead and protect those areas proactively before they become threatened. So hopefully this graphic, you can kind of navigate your way around here and see what these templates are considering important, and think about what you would consider important. What seems the most important to you? And then the last criteria that your book mentioned, and that we're going to be talking about more in the next couple weeks, is connectedness. So protected areas that are connected by habitat, or at least by like permeable human land uses. So what does that mean? Well, like if you're at most species of animals or plants, a agricultural field is more permeable, like you can move through it more easily than a city, for example. So protected areas that are connected by either habitat that's privately owned or by like agriculture or biodiversity friendly land uses are more likely to sustain healthy wildlife populations or plant populations. And so why is that? Well, remember what we learned about the last couple of weeks, which is if you're a small population, you're in trouble, right? You're in trouble because you're likely to have inbreeding issues because there's not that many individuals to mate with, and because you're just more at risk to be wiped out by a random event like a tornado or a tsunami or just a really bad drought year. Those things could take out your whole population. So let's look at this. This corridor here is the Mesoamerican biological corridor. And what it's showing you is in green, protected areas, and then in red, biological corridors. So those biological corridors, they have a lot of privately owned land, but they're areas that the governments of those countries are prioritizing to say, let's try and give these landowners incentives to protect that land, because we know that if just these protected areas, like especially some of those smaller ones, over time they're not enough. They have to be connected to other protected areas in order to sustain populations. So we'll talk more about the Mesoamerican biological corridor in the next couple of weeks, because I'm going to be telling you about some of my research in that region with bats. So that'll be fun. And then, of course, some of the other important factors that you always have to consider in biodiversity conservation are cost. cost, right? You don't have infinite funding and resources to protect areas. So there's been a couple of papers that have tried to look at like how much does it cost to protect different taxa, different groups of species. And I took one of the more recent ones, this Gordon et al. 2019. And what they did was they looked at the cost of protecting these different taxa in New Zealand, where they were based, and then in the United States. And I'm showing you the New Zealand graph because the United States just had a lot of variability. But what they found across both places is that mammals are really expensive to protect. Mammals are very expensive. And more expensive to protect than plants, and way more expensive to protect than aquatic invertebrates. And birds are also more reasonably expensive to protect, as are amphibians. So one thing you might think here is that one of the reasons plants are easier to protect is because they're primary producers, right? So you don't really have to protect their food source. Their food source is soil and sun. So you just have to protect the land. Whereas for species up the food web, up the food chain and higher trophic levels, you have to protect their food source too. Like for amphibians, you have to protect aquatic invertebrates and plants. For birds and mammals, you have to protect the plants and the other animals that they feed on. So it's harder to protect them. It's more expensive. Okay, so cost has to be taken into account. We've looked at that in several of our workshops, right? You looked at that in your invasive species workshop. How much is it going to cost to keep these areas pristine? You looked at that in your California condor workshop. How much is it going to cost to keep this species on the landscape? It's a big consideration in conservation. And then other important factors are human values, right? So this is the last slide I want to talk to you about because you're going to watch a couple of videos on this. But basically, so when you go to protect an area, to pour resources into protecting that area, it's important to think about, you know, maybe all other things being equal, like species diversity, species richness, irreplaceability, vulnerability, those things are all the same. But there's one of those areas has a strong importance to indigenous or non-indigenous cultures, then you'd want to protect that area, right? And one thing I wanted to point out in this lecture is that in our efforts, like global non-indigenous efforts to protect land have been just like a little bit less successful at preserving biodiversity than indigenous managed lands. So that's what this paper is showing. So this paper by Schuster et al. Was also from 2019. And what this paper looked at is, you can see in the figure, the total vertebrate species richness in Australia, Brazil, and Canada. On indigenous lands, that's in the red, protected areas, that's in the green, and non-protected areas, that's in the blue. So you can see, like, if you look at that graph, so the box with the line through it, thick line is the mean. So the mean vertebrate species richness. It is higher in the indigenous managed lands for all three of those places. So this is really important to think about, right? It's higher unsurprisingly than non-protected areas, but it's even higher than state protected areas. So this leads us to an important point, which is that indigenous people's knowledge of how to protect, how to do conservation, which is something we talked about way back in the beginning of class, that conservation hasn't only been happening since conservation biology started in the 80s. Many cultures and indigenous peoples continue to practice conservation measures that are highly effective. And I'm going to move my head here. But this knowledge, this traditional knowledge that has helped their conservation efforts on indigenous lands be successful, it hasn't always been valued in like the Western field of conservation. In some places, you'll see this in one of the videos, when governments decide we're going to protect an area and draw a line around it, indigenous peoples have sometimes been actually evicted from those areas so that they'll be pristine and human free. But that's totally overlooking the fact that those peoples have lived there for thousands of years and are part of the reason why those ecosystems are healthy. And this is slowly changing in some places. So that's the last slide I have for you today, but the next two videos that you'll watch are two short videos that talk about Indigenous peoples in protected areas and conservation using Indigenous knowledge. So enjoy watching those videos. That's all for today. And on Wednesday, we have a special day because it's Earth Day. If we were in class, we'd have a special celebration with candy kisses for Earth Day, but we're not in class. So maybe I will eat a candy kiss and you can have one in your house by yourself. But we're going to do a really fun workshop. I finally get to do a workshop on bats, and it's going to be a conservation planning workshop with bats. So like we started before the Easter recess, instead of just posting up the information about the workshop, I'm actually going to do the live Zoom meeting at 1 o'clock. The link is on there on Moodle. And in the Zoom meeting, we'll just do a check-in, and then I'll walk you through and introduce you to the workshop. So please log into that if you can. If you can't log in, no problem. You don't have to. You can watch the video. You can watch the video and then do the workshop on your own time. Okay, thank you all, and I'll see you on Wednesday.